I've been playing a lot of Crash Team Racing lately, more so than Final Fantasy, which is supposed to be my main thing. I promise, a lot more Final Fantasy grinding is coming, but it's for good reason. The first thing I ever actually even tried to speedrun was Crash Team Racing way back in about 2016, long before I'd even wanted to speedrun seriously at all. The inspiration started when I came across Walkernut's Games Done Quick speedrun from a couple years prior. It brought back a lot of nostalgia for me, and the driving looked really smooth and the shortcuts being performed absolutely blew my mind. So I immediately replayed the game and started trying to speedrun it. For some reason the goal in my mind became to beat the game in under 55 minutes. I really did try to remember why I chose this goal, but I just couldn't. From memory, the time that I got my run down to was around 1 hour and 1 minute. I have no recorded footage of it at all though, but I do have distinct memories of needing to turn on my air conditioning towards the end of runs because I'd get really nervous and start running hot. Speedrunning was very much a side hobby for me at the time and not something that I was putting any focus on at all. In 2021 or so, I started speedrunning Final Fantasy IX, eventually branching out to a few other games, and got myself a copy of Crash Team Racing to slowly start working towards that goal I'd set myself so long ago. I pretty much had to start from scratch. A lot of my fundamentals were really rusty. For starters, when drifting, unlike Mario Kart where you get a boost based on how long you hold the drift for, in Crash Team Racing you actually have to tap the opposite bumper to manually boost as this meter here fills up. You get a boost and some speed in reserves based on how full the bar is. To quickly break down the run, there are 4 hubs, each containing 4 races, and a boss race against a character on their home track. Hub 1 starts with some really basic tracks, Crash Cove, Ruse Tubes, and Mystery Caves, each containing very little speed tech, before finishing off with Sewer Speedway, which has this intended shortcut, and these slopes which you travel quicker while riding on, and the boss stage being Ripperoo himself. Hub 2 starts with Tiger Temple, in which a damaging item must be used to open this door. This adds a small amount of RNG to the track. Hub 2 also contains Papu's Pyramid, which was one of the first glitch shortcuts that a lot of players learn. By hopping onto this fence, which will do everything in its power to throw you off of it, you can skip to a section just before the finish line, avoiding this large hairpin turn, saving about 6 seconds per lap. Hub 3 opens with Blizzard Bluff, a fairly straightforward track with this nasty little fence hop. It's surprisingly difficult. Dragon Mines also has this section where you can drive along the minecart tracks to save about 3 seconds per lap, but you risk getting squished by a minecart if this is not done properly. There's also Polar Pass, which has a few tough jumps, but we'll get to that in a bit. Hub 4 is far and away the hardest. Engine Labs has a series of tight turns and plenty of space on the track to fall off if you aren't careful, and Cortex Castle seems to be built entirely of right angles, making for some really nasty turns. Hot Air Skyway has very few barriers around the track, meaning it's easy to fall off. There's also this fence hop to skip a big part of the track, and a much more difficult shortcut to skip the downward spiral section to save a few extra seconds per lap, but I'll get to that later as well. The run ends on Oxide Station, which is actually pretty easy at first. The roads are nice and wide and there's plenty of boost pads. There's this really easy fence hop to skip the entire outer space section, which pretty much negates any chance of losing the race. The difficulty comes in when you get more optimal, using this fence hop to skip the downward spiral, then driving backwards up the spiral, and using this fence hop to skip the tunnel section. Chaining this all together with the fence hop that skips out of space can net you a 45-second lap if done well. And with this, the run is closed out. The way shortcuts sort of work in this game is that the game will load a portion of the track in front of you so that you can make intended jumps. So if you land on an unloaded portion of the track, your mask will pick you up and drop you back where you jumped from. This is why you'll see top players do U-turns on certain tracks. They're loading the portion of the track that they want to skip to, and then jumping to it from an earlier part of the track. These skips are really difficult though, and require a lot of practice, and I knew that I didn't need to rely on any of them just yet. So I kept it simple, and stuck with what I knew. Taking a look at some of my old VODs, I can see that I'd done at least one run with a time of 1 hour, 15 minutes and 28 seconds, but my first submitted run was 1 hour, 1 minute and 58 seconds on the 2nd of December 2021. Looking at this feels rough. My boosts are really low, my turns are so wide, I'm hardly even doing any shortcuts, and there are so many bonks and bumps on the walls and mistakes. As I got more familiar with the game and its mechanics, I worked my time down to a 58.25 that month, but it was very much the same in terms of the aspects of my skill that had room for improvement, I was just getting a bit more consistent and making fewer mistakes. I found myself getting uncharacteristically nervous when I would play this game on stream, and unfortunately my reaction was to play less. I wish I'd found a better way to deal with this at the time, but eventually I started playing again more in July of 2022, though it was off stream. I got my time down to 57 minutes and 14 seconds and found myself in a fun rivalry with fellow Australian speedrunner Naze. Our PBs were very close, so it was good fun. I started running again properly in November and worked my time down to 56 minutes and 54 seconds. Looking at how I brought my time down, I was taking a lot more shortcuts that I wasn't used to, making fewer mistakes, taking turns tighter, and just overall driving better. I wish there was a better way that I could explain it. At this point though, I started to find progression particularly difficult. I wasn't sure exactly what I was doing that was so much slower than all the other runners. I looked at VODs of better runs and they were playing so similarly to me, using all the same shortcuts and similar lines and so on. I just didn't get it. I knew that the PAL version could save a huge amount of time, at least 40 seconds by use of the language glitch. When prompted to choose a language at the start of the game, pressing cancel selects no language and thus no dialogue loads. This helps you exit levels faster as your mask can't congratulate you for getting a trophy, and skips an entire boss dialogue section. It's also got a fun quirk where the heads of the bosses get rearranged, and the one for Komodo Joe's dialogue gets replaced with the game's ending with N-Oxide. This, to put it simply, freaks out the game because it's trying to load the ending before it actually happens, and the game responds by skipping the cutscene entirely. The downside of PAL is that the game runs at 25 frames per second instead of 30. The driving itself is just more difficult, and I believe you don't jump quite as high, making a lot of shortcuts really difficult too. I started running again in June of 2023, and played on PAL as a kind of cheap way to improve my time. It almost felt like cheating at that level. Ultimately though, I found the driving so much better on NTSC, that I was willing to concede the time from the cutscenes and dialogue, and put more focus onto simply driving better, taking tighter lines, learning better shortcuts and consistent setups for them, and so on. By July, I'd put in a lot more practice, really started to get the hang of some of these more difficult shortcuts, and found myself on pace to finally hit that goal I'd set myself almost 7 years prior. I was well over a full minute ahead of my personal best. But then, tragedy. I have no idea what was happening here. I'd somehow ended up out of bounds but also on a sort of shelf in the level's geometry and just bouncing around helplessly. Ultimately, it cost me just enough time for the sub 55 to slip through my fingers. Around this time, I had a marathon run coming up for Final Fantasy VIII, and went on to grind that game exclusively for the rest of the year, so Crash Team Racing took a bit of a backseat. At the start of 2024 though, was the main thing that really drove me to improve. A friendly competition between a group of mates. Futurama speedrunning legend Style and I set up a leaderboard for some of the Australian runners, including myself, Damosk, Liquid Wi-Fi, and Naze, for time trials. I don't exactly remember the original inspiration behind the leaderboard, but we were very much all learning and improving together and at a relatively similar level. We got to talk a bit of trash and very much just have fun with it all. Seeing someone post a killer time on a track really got people driven to beat it. I'm not sure how seriously everyone else was taking it, but that competitive itch of mine was really satisfied every time I got to knock a few milliseconds off a track PB, and before I knew it, I'd improved significantly as a player. I got inspired to submit Crash Team Racing to the Oz Speedruns event at the Game Expo, and I wanted to make sure I put on a great show. In practicing, I started to learn some harder shortcuts such as this Polar Pass boomerang, really start to nail the Papu's Pyramid fence hop, this U-turn shortcut on Hot Air Skyway, and really start to nail the Oxide Station Mega shortcut. Most importantly though, my driving was simply better and I was much more confident thanks to the hours of work I'd put in on those time trials. Trying and failing, learning more about the game's mechanics, and pushing tracks just that little bit further than I thought I could led me to become pretty consistent, and for the most part it paid off. The run went awesome. Tragedy did once again strike on Oxide Station, and I barely missed that time that I really wanted for the marathon run, but I felt like I put on a fantastic show with the help of Clock District, and I got a lot of praise for my run there. This really inspired me to further improve the time when Crash Team Racing got accepted into the DreamHack Melbourne event in April. I grinded those shortcuts harder and made so many fundamental improvements. In a practice run, I ended up finally clearing that goal of 55 minutes. I was over the moon, but it was eye-opening. The run was so far below what I'd come to expect from myself and was littered with mistakes. I realized that I could go even further than the 54-minute barrier and decided to push for a run in the 53-minute region. That was my new goal. The DreamHack run went awesome. I got to show off even more of those shortcuts and improvements I'd made, and I also got to have Naze, who was my original competition to improve as much as I had, on the couch to commentate the run with me in Clock District. My time in the marathon was 56 minutes and 11 seconds, which was yet another eye-opening moment. If I could do that in a marathon where I only had one chance, I could absolutely push that personal best down further. I'd gone through my training arc, and it was time to get that 53-minute time. It began to actually feel wrong to perform this grind exclusively off-stream. I felt a strong desire to not let my nerves get the better of me. It was a bit uncomfortable at first, but I'd started streaming my speedruns of Crash Team Racing again. In May, I found myself on a run that, on paper, didn't look like it would improve much. I'd missed out on a lot of my potential time saves during hubs 2 and 3, but I knew I had one trick up my sleeve: Hot Air Skyway. I've shown this a few times in this video, but by driving to the area just before the large downward spiral, you load the lower path of the track. By doing a U-turn, you can drive to an earlier section of the track and drop down to it with a really tight jump between this fence. Go too far left, you leave the playable area and get masked. Go too far to the right, and you'll grind against the fence and fall to your death. If you get it just right though, you can drop to this lower section of the track, skipping this big spiral and the jumps before it. It's a tough trick, but it can save about 5 seconds per lap if done efficiently. Given that you race this track twice, that's about 30 seconds across all 6 laps. I nailed the skip all 3 times. My personal best at the time did have a mistake on Oxide Station, and unfortunately this one was actually a bit worse. Luckily, my second race on Hot Air Skyway picked a lot of that time back up, and I closed out the run with a really good Oxide Station. In my next personal best, I'd kept up with my prior run until tragedy struck on Blizzard Bluff with a botched fence op. I got a bit desperate and risked something that I typically wouldn't with a lap 1 Polar Pass boomerang. The shortcut is performed by boosting here backwards, jumping off of the fence, and skipping that larger U-turn section, which saves about 5 seconds per lap. The issue with this is that the CPU drivers are racing towards you while you're going for a very specific lineup, and oftentimes will collide head-on with you as you're trying this. If you can get there really quickly, it stops becoming an issue, but it was a risk I was willing to take. I ended up landing the shortcut 3 for 3 and got a really nice dip back into the green. Hub 4 contained only minor mistakes and even cleaner shortcuts for the hardest tracks in the game. I played my very last Oxide race extremely carefully to sort of lock in that pace, as it was so close to my new goal.
Wait.
Yes! Fucking yes, cunt! Finally fucking closed it out. Fuck yes, cunt! I achieved a time of 53 minutes and 44 seconds. Of course, there were a few minor mistakes, but very little in the ways of absolute tragedy. Only Polar Pass, unfortunately. All of my practice had been realized with this run, and I'm extremely proud of it. I executed Hub 4 exactly as I wanted to. There were some minor mistakes earlier in the run, but I didn't let them get the best of me and recovered really well. Most importantly, I felt like I'd really defeated the mindset that prevented me from feeling like I could stream my attempts. Of course I felt nervous heading into the last few tracks, but I didn't let that feeling win. I really wish I could describe in more detail how I managed to overcome these feelings. I keep trying to find the words, but they just escape me before I can put it into writing. From here, it looks really difficult to improve my run further. Sure, I could pick Dingo Dial, he's faster, but so many other top runs use Coco. Why can't I? Playing on a slim PS2 costs about 10 to 15 seconds as the game doesn't run as well, so I could buy a better unit, but I'm not really interested in doing that. If I look at all this objectively though, I felt the same way when my PB was in the 56-minute area, and I know that the improvements were made in my driving and my shortcuts. While my driving feels really good now, I know that there's room for improvement simply in the quality of my driving. Who knows what's in store for me with Crash Team Racing in the future, but at the very least I can look back on what I've done so far and be proud. I want to give a special thanks to Naze, Silent Eye, Liquid Wi-Fi and Damosk, as well as a few other Australian runners who picked up the game recently, Clock District and Blakey B. Thanks as well, as always, to the Patreon supporters. $2 a month you get to vote on a monthly speedrun challenge, such as the Time Crisis 3 No Damage, the Crash Team Racing 101% run and so on. And of course, thank you for watching. See you next time.